On today's episode of The Instinctive Australian Shepherd, we're going to talk about chores. I'm going to share with you the 6 most common chores that my Aussies do on my ranch on a regular basis. And then I'm going to talk to you about something that they do that's not ranching related per se, but is extremely valuable. So stay tuned. This podcast is dedicated to the celebration and preservation of the working Australian Shepherd. Your Aussie is descended from a proud and amazing lineage of hard-working ranch dogs, identified and cultivated primarily in the Wild West. Contrary to the breed name, the Australian Shepherd is actually an American breed success story. Only in America can a blue-eyed, scruffy dog rise from the dust of the American ranch to become one of the most popular breeds in the world today. The Aussie's beauty, brains, and incredible work ethic and almost empathic connection with their human charges make them unforgettable and pivotal members of the family. My goal is to help you understand this amazing breed, learn more about their heritage and their physical and mental needs so that together we can preserve the working Aussie by encouraging better breeding and better vetting of future Aussie owners, ultimately keeping Aussies with their families and out of shelters. Welcome to the Instinctive Australian Shepherd. Hey everybody, Jackie Tinker here. Welcome! It's the 15th episode of the Instinctive Australian Shepherd. I'm very excited about today's episode because I just get to sit down and talk to you about the awesome things that my dogs do on my ranch every day. So, before we get started, I want to make a little announcement. About 3 months ago, I took over the Working Aussie Source website, which is www.workingaussiesource.com. This site has been around for several years, and it's the primary listing site for working Australian Shepherd breeders, litters, puppies, those kinds of things. Every breeder on that site has been vetted by a committee of people who work on ranches and who use Australian Shepherds on a regular basis. So you know that if you go to this site, you're going to find a breeder that is truly raising working Australian Shepherds. And I say that as a preface to what I'm going to be talking about today. If I didn't have working bred Australian Shepherds, I couldn't do the things that we're going to talk about today. It's simply impossible. Aussies just aren't being bred in the mainstream breed. They're not being bred to work anymore. They're being bred to be pets primarily, and then secondarily to sporting dogs like agility and obedience and rally and things like that. But the number of breeders out there who truly breed working Aussies, who use their Aussies on their ranch, and who raise working litters, there are very few of them left. And so we've created a spot for you, the listener, the person who needs a working Aussie, to find a working bred Australian Shepherd. So check out workingaussiesource.com. In addition to litters and breeders, there's a whole bunch of resources and articles and great information that'll get you started working with your Aussie. Let's get started. A working bred Australian Shepherd can be one of the most valuable assets on your farm or ranching operation. It doesn't matter if you have 5 head or 5,000 head or 500,000 head of livestock. There are some chores where this little ball of fluff becomes your best hand. And I have friends who have said that a working Aussie or a good working dog can replace up to 5 cowboys for some activities and chores. And that's huge. Very, very huge. Now, most of us have had dogs. I had dogs growing up my whole life. And most people have had dogs in their lives. But most of the time, our dogs are just pets. They sleep on the bed, they lay on the couch, they maybe bark at the mailman, but they're basically pets. The concept of a dog having a job is foreign to most people. Dogs that work are pretty rare nowadays. But back in the early days of our country, dogs were an integral part of the farm, and they had jobs. They were useful. They didn't just sleep on the bed. They probably weren't even allowed on the bed. but they had to earn their keep. They kept varmints and rats out of the feed. They may have guarded the livestock as a livestock guardian dog, or they may have done what a working Australian Shepherd does, is work around the ranch to herd and move and help and do chores around the ranch. So the thing about a working dog, especially a working Aussie, since that's what we're talking about here, working Aussies live to work. They love working. It's a joy to them. It's fun. It's a game. It's pleasure. You should see their faces. They have the biggest smiles on their faces when they're working, and they just are driven to do it. It's inside of them. And it comes out, and either they have the drive to work or they don't. But when they do have that drive to work, it's what they live for. Second to their family, because Aussies are very human-centric, and that makes them different from other working breeds, herding breeds, that they focus mostly on their families, and they're very loyal and they love their families, but working dogs love to work. I discovered working Aussies when I was around 14. I was given my first working Australian Shepherd. Her name was Raisin. She was a Windsong Raising Cane daughter who was a very popular working stud back in the 80s. And since Raisin, I have always had a working Aussie. I've never even considered not getting a working Aussie, even when there were times in my life I didn't need a working Aussie. I had one anyway because I just value that amazing thing that they are. So when I was a teenager, we used Raisin a little bit here and there. We didn't have a lot of work for her to do, but we had some work for her to do from time to time. My dad decided he wanted to raise pigs, and we were living in western Minnesota at the time. And the whole getting prepared for raising pigs is quite an ordeal because the barns have to have so many different rooms, and oh my gosh, it's this very detailed amount of construction that you have to do, and it's just tons of construction you have to do. So in the meantime, while they were constructing the pig facilities, he leased our land out to my great uncle for his Black Angus cattle. So the day my great uncle arrived with his trailer pot full of Black Angus cattle to put out on our land, they decided, I'm not exactly sure why, I don't remember because it was a long time ago, that they were going to put all the cows in this lean-to. I guess maybe for a while until they settled or something. I'm not sure. But we had a huge barn. It was huge. It was big enough to put in several of those ginormous, huge combines and tractors and stuff like that. So the lean-to was attached to the side of the ginormous barn. The lean-to had a wall on 3 sides. So when the cows looked in, it was a dark tunnel because it was a very large barn. Now, in all of our intelligence, I'm not exactly sure why the 3 of us couldn't figure this part out, but the barn door had a big, huge sliding door on it, large sliding door. And that sliding door was open, and so was the other one on the other end of the barn. So you could see daylight through the big sliding doors of the barn. I'm not exactly sure if there was maybe a strand of hot wire between the open door and the lean-to, or if we just didn't even think to close the barn door. I remember thinking this was just really dumb, why we had this open, but I was not in charge because I was the kid. So my uncle decided he was going to get the cows out of the trailer by standing in the middle of the lean-to section, right in the middle of it. And my uncle was about 5'5". He had hair that stuck out like a troll doll on the top of his head and a big old scruffy beard, just like a troll doll. And that's what he looked like. He was wearing overalls, and you kind of have to picture in your head, and he was jumping up and down, waving his arms and cussing and, trying to get the cows to come to him while jumping up and down and cussing. And my dad and Raisin and myself were at the back of the herd of cattle and trying to push them forward while my uncle's hollering and throwing a fit. And Raisin figured out very quickly that her job was to move the cows past my uncle into that lean-to where they did not want to go. They wanted to go around the side of the lean-to or through the big barn with a big open escape at the end. And she worked that group the whole entire time. And so I don't think my uncle ever got it. I don't think he ever understood that, he was one of those guys who's raised cattle for a long time but understood nothing about cattle. And he just never got it. Later on in the farm, when we had pigs, I would use Raisin's children to move pigs around. And it was just incredibly useful. And it was very, eye-opening to me. And to me, it just wasn't even a second thought. I have this dog that can do the job. Why don't I use the dog? Sometimes it's tricky convincing people like ranchers and stuff to change their ways. But hopefully in this podcast episode, you're going to be able to see all the very useful things that you can do with an Australian Shepherd. Actually, let me back that up. Not all the things you can do with them. 6 things that you can do with them, because I don't have time in one day to do all the things an Australian Shepherd can do. So let's get started with chore number 1. And this one I use every single day. Every day I use this chore because it is holding stock off of feed. So when I go out to do my chores, we recently moved to a larger ranch. We were in a very small place before, and I still use this chore every day. This was, on a couple of acres with some sheep. Every single day my dogs did this. And now we've moved to a larger area, and I still do this when I feed. I don't always have to feed, but I usually feed just a little bit to make sure. When I feed my sheep, it's not really for nourishment because they get a lot of hay or a lot of grass, and we're using rotational grazing and doing the sustainable homesteading thing on our ranch. So while it may not be necessary to feed my stock every day, I'll usually feed them a little bit just so that I can pull them up and have my eyes on them to make sure that their worm load is okay, that they don't need treatment for any injuries, if they don't make sure their feet don't need to be trimmed, etc. I like to put my eyes on my livestock every day if possible, just to make sure everything's okay. So if you've ever had sheep, I think sheep are the worst as far as their behavior. Sheep, I love sheep. I really do. They're really my favorite thing. I love sheep. But they can be really obnoxious. At least my sheep can be really obnoxious. So I've been on Facebook groups before, and I'm in a lot of Facebook groups with sheep breeders and sheep owners. And I hear all the time, how much trouble they have feeding their sheep because, my sheep, if I didn't have a dog with me and I had a bucket of feed or 2 buckets of feed, it would take me an hour to walk from the gate to the feeder because they'll just smush around me, or they'll try to climb on me, or they'll try and jump in the buckets, and I have to hold the buckets over my head and then try and walk while they're jumping on my feet and trying to get to the feed because they're really obnoxious. So this is where I use my dogs. I walk to the gate with my dog. The sheep do not come to the gate because they know what will happen if they come up to the dog. They respect the dog. There is a communication between sheep and dog, and the sheep respect that. So when I open the gate, I don't have to fight with sheep and try and keep them inside the gate and do all that. There's nobody at the gate because they're standing a good distance off, being respectful and doing what they're supposed to be doing. I'll have my dog walk up and watch them. And she usually Harley will just lie down usually. Copper stands, Harley lies down, and she watches them. And if they come and get pushy, then she'll get up and she'll move towards them, and then they back off. So I can pour feed out without anybody running on me, jumping on me, stepping on my feet, or tripping me, or running into my knees, because sheep are really good at that. Once the feed is poured out, the sheep are still being held off by the dog. They get held off until it's my decision for them to come to the feed when I'm safe distance away. So I'll move off to the side, and I'll either call the dog off by saying that'll do and have Harley come running to me, or, which I usually do this because the dogs enjoy it, I'll let them go gather the sheep in and bring them to the feed trough. They don't have to do much work there because the sheep are charging towards the feed trough, but the dogs really enjoy getting around the backside of the sheep and kind of fetching them. So I'll send them on a go-by or way to me and let them gather the sheep to the feed trough. Now, once we're at the feed trough, the job is done. So then the dog has to just turn their working switch off. And mine are pretty good at it. When I tell them that'll do, they realize that the job is over and then they can wander around and do whatever. And usually the Harley will go up and she'll get a bite of food out of the bin with the sheep in it by the feeding area. And she'll go up there and take a bite, and the sheep don't really mind her because her working switch is turned off. And I think this is one of the coolest things. I just love this about working dogs. They aren't bothering the sheep. The sheep keep eating. They don't really worry about Harley. And she'll go around to another bucket and take another bite of food, or she'll go around and sniff a sheep or lick an ear, and that's what she does. The boys are more concerned about sniffing the rears of everybody out there. So they'll go sniff everybody and check on everybody. It's like they're doing their own check. And while they're doing all that, the sheep are not bothered because their working switch is off. Now, if I decided that I wanted the sheep to get off the feed for whatever reason, I could send the dog around and say, get back. And they would bring the sheep off the feed and get the sheep away from the feed that they really want to be to, because then their switch is turned on and they communicate to the sheep, hey, we're move it now. I'm in charge. Get going. It's whatever communication they use. It's pretty amazing how good they are at it and how well they understand each other. And sometimes I'll do that to teach my dogs how to use pressure and do things that are difficult, like pulling sheep off a feed is very difficult. So I'll do that as training exercise sometimes. You can do this with cattle too. I find that most cattle are a little bit more respectful. They're smarter than sheep, I think, and more patient. Maybe it's more patient than sheep. They don't push it once they figure the whole routine out. You could do it with cattle too. And with cattle, it's also a safety issue because you don't want to really be walking amongst the cows while you're putting out feed, because you have to focus on carrying the feed and pouring it out. And sometimes the bags are heavy. If you're doing that, you don't really need to have your attention split. And when you're working with livestock, you really need to be paying attention. They're not humans. They don't have the ability to reason. They'll make decisions based off of something you can't see. And, you really need to have your focus on what's going on. And when you have a dog holding the stock off the feed, then you don't have to worry about being run over. You've got somebody that's got your back. If something spooks the cows and they start running, that dog can stop them. And you've got the ability to really focus on what's going on, and you have a great partner. So it's a really, really useful chore, and my dogs do this every single day. So when my dogs are wandering around the sheep or the cows or whatever, we don't really wander around amongst the cows. That's not very safe. But amongst the sheep, I let them wander around the sheep, as I mentioned before. I have the time then, because everyone's calm, I can check everybody, and this is how I maintain the health of my flock and my herd, whatever. I will check all the animals over, check to see if they need to be wormed, if they have any injuries, or, whatever's going on with them, make sure they all look healthy. And if they're pregnant, then I can see how far along they are. I could just check all those things by just putting my eyes on them while they're eating. That's another reason why I feed every day, so that I can put my eyes on the livestock to keep them as healthy as possible. Okay. Number 2, the second chore that I use, and really I hadn't been using it a whole lot until recently because my facility has changed. As I mentioned before, we moved to a bigger place, and I'm using electric net fences for the first time ever, and we're doing rotational grazing. Number 2 chore is holding gates. And in my old place, I really never had a need really to hold gates. But this place, I have a need now to hold gates on a regular basis. Holding a gate is basically opening the gate and putting the dog as the gate while you drive through, while you do something where you don't want the animals to get through, but you have to have the gate open. If you're moving hay, maybe you're moving a round bale in and you need to get that tractor through, the dog can hold the gate. Now, you're not going to position the dog in the middle so that you run over with the tractor, obviously, but you can position the dog in a place where the dog is safe and they can keep the stock back while you drive through in and out of the gate. And that's what holding a gate is. I interviewed on episode 7 of the podcast, Susan Boyd. I interviewed Susan Boyd from New Mexico on Boyd Ranch. They have a very large ranch, and it was a very interesting episode on how she uses her dogs on her ranch. As she told a story about how she figured out how to take 4 or 5 of her dogs and use them as a gate, but to sort through. So she was sorting cattle in and out of a fence, and she used her dogs as a gate. So I would encourage you to listen to that episode because that was just ingenious and very interesting way to use a dog to hold a gate and to use the dogs as a sorting gate. That you have to have very obedient dogs, which she does. So it was a really good story. You should listen to that. I used it recently when we set up our first rotational grazing. We had our electric net fences set up, and my sheep were coming from my friend's house. When we moved here, we had 6 weeks that we had to be kind of homeless while this house was closing because it took forever to close. So my sheep stayed out with a friend. Well, I went to go pick them up, and we brought them back here. It was extremely hot. So we just pulled the trailer in, dumped the sheep out, unhooked the trailer, left it in the middle of the net fencing pasture, and then took off out of there. Well, Well, it wasn't my trailer because when I left my friend's house, my trailer had 2 flat tires, so I had to borrow her trailer. So we had to set up a time to switch trailers. So I had to pull the trailer out of the net fencing, hook it up to the truck, pull it out of the net fencing without all my sheep getting out. And so Harley had to hold the gate for the first time because we hadn't really needed this before. In our other place, we didn't have this situation. So that's what we did. And the first time when I went, had her push the sheep off, because as soon as I hit the fence or as soon as I come near the fence, the sheep think they're getting fed, so they come running up to the fence. And then when I open the gate, they want to run out, obviously, because, well, they're sheep. I had her drive them down to the end of the net fencing pasture. And then I told her to lay down. I got in the truck and started to drive through. Well, she did not realize, she had not been trained to do this before, and she thought I was leaving her, so she ran to the truck. So I had to train her really quickly, show her that she needed to stay there, and it worked out pretty well. She figured it out really quickly that I wasn't going to leave her. So I was able to pull in there and then turn around, hook the trailer up. She's holding the sheep off and drive out while she holds the sheep away from the gate so they don't escape. It's extremely useful because it would have, I don't even know how I would have done it otherwise because the sheep would have been everywhere. I would have had to feed them a lot of food to keep them away from me for that amount of time. And that's just not the way to go. So that's holding gates, extremely useful. I guess we're on number 3, moving stock around the place. That's what I just called it, moving stock around the place. Well, you have to move from pen to pen. You have to, if you're moving cattle from pasture to pasture, if you're gathering something up to put in the trailer's lot to load, if you're gathering them to work them somewhere, you need to be able to move your stock around. Dairy farmers will use Aussies to gather the cattle up when it's time for milking. I used it the other day when I had a lesson coming in and I needed to get my sheep to currently I have 1 pen that I can do lessons in. And it's not the net fencing. You can't do lessons, not starting lessons in a net fence. So I had to move them to the 1 working pen that I have. And Harley we fetched a little bit and we drove a little bit and put them in the pen and sorted out the ones I wanted and put the rest back in the net fencing, and it was easy. This is just one of the most useful things you can do. There's always times when you have livestock, you need to move them somewhere. And having a dog that can do that is extremely useful. I'm going to tell you a story about moving stock around the place. This is Copper, a story about my red dog, Copper. He's my youngest dog. I have 3 adult dogs and 2 pups. I should say they're about a year old now, so I guess they're not puppies anymore. It was in our old place this spring during lambing season. Of course, it always happens during lambing season that we have the worst weather. We live in Texas, and the weather's really pretty good here most of the time. We have to have shade because it gets hot. But there's not a lot of bad weather. There's not a lot of extended periods of time where you have bad weather, rain, or hail and stuff like that. It just doesn't happen very often. But this year was very strange. This year, oh my goodness, it was the craziest year ever. I don't think it stopped raining from last September all the way through March. Really, at my place, I really don't think it. I think we had 4 weeks from September to March that we didn't have a significant rainfall. So every time it rained, and usually it rained 2 or 3 times a week, and it rained at least 2 to 3 inches a time. It was craziness. It was absolute craziness. So it got cold, and it got wet, and this was like March, and we just had a really quick temperature drop, and it was pouring down rain. It had been raining all week. There was not a dry spot on my place. And I, of course, started having lambs, baby lambs being born, and there was no place for them to be dry. A friend of mine always told me that sheep can be wet and sheep can be cold, but it's really hard on them to be wet and cold. So every time it's wet and cold, I usually try to find a place for my sheep to go. Well, we had the big shop, and it was a concrete floored shop. It wasn't made for animals. It was a shop. But I was going to put them in there just to make sure my babies had some place to go, because even the ones that hadn't been born in the last 24 hours, the little bit older ones, were having a hard time because it was just so cold and wet. Of course, it was dark. It started to pour down rain, and the temperature was supposed to drop. So I got Copper. And the reason I got Copper is because Copper is not emotional about the babies. He treats them very nicely and very kindly, but he doesn't get emotionally involved. Harley and Wyatt just can't handle it. They love babies so much, they just can't stop licking them. And so when I need them to put pressure on and move something, it is difficult because they just really love those babies so much. They're so tenderhearted about those babies, which is endearing. But in this situation, I needed a dog that was not emotional about the babies, and that's Copper. All we had to do was take him from the pasture that was right next to, very small pasture, more like a paddock, next to the shop, flip him through the gate and right into the shop. That's it. And the shop had big roll-up doors. We didn't have to go far. It took forever because if you've ever raised sheep, when they give birth, they don't want to be around anything else for around 24 to 48 hours. They go off by themselves and they have their babies off by themselves and they don't move. They don't really want to come around. They're difficult to move and they're just not their normal compliant selves. Copper and I moved those sheep inch by very hard-earned inch up to the gate and got them flipped around heading to the door. So they were all standing right outside the door. The door was wide open. I had put hay and I had put feed in buckets, just in case you were wondering. That doesn't usually work. When a sheep decides it's afraid or doesn't want to go somewhere, it's not hungry anymore. So I showed them the food, I showed them the hay, but they stood right outside that door. They did not want to put one little centimeter of a hoof on that concrete, even though they had been in this building before. Well, I had just bought 5 new ewes because I knew that my sheep were going to be heavy in giving birth and I had to do lessons and I didn't want them working while they were about to give birth. So I went to the sale barn thinking I was pretty much a smart little chickie here. Went to the sale barn and bought 5 young ewes, very young ewes. You know, they were just maybe a little bit older than lambs, very young. And I thought I was pretty smart. I got this all figured out. Now I got them about a month ahead of time so I could work on them, get them used to the dogs and all that. So they were calm. We'll talk about that later. But then turns out they were all bred and they all gave birth before my sheep did. All but one gave birth before my sheep did. So my brilliant plan didn't work out so well and had to postpone lessons for a few weeks. All of that to tell you that I had 5 new sheep that weren't used to working with a dog. They hadn't been trained with my dogs. They were brand new and they had just had babies, so they were not cooperative and they didn't understand the program. One in particular was quite difficult. There were 20-some sheep that we were trying to move into, plus babies, so 40 we were trying to move into this shop. And since they're a big clump, Copper had to wear along the back of them to put pressure along all sides of the back of the sheep to try and move them forward. And every time he would leave the area where this crazy sheep was, she would take off into the dark with her baby. Copper goes and brings her back. This happened like 3 or 4 or 5 times. I finally told him, just leave it, and we'll get her later. Let's get the rest of these in here, but he did not want to do that. So he went out one last time, and it took him a long time to get back. And I thought, what is going on? So I step out of the building and look around the corner, and apparently she had decided she was no longer going to come back to the group. He grabbed her by the side where her wool was, and he grabbed her wool and was pulling her to the building. 50-pound dog versus 120-plus pound sheep, pulling her in. He pulled her in the building, deposited her right by the feed, and started to head back out into the dark. And he turns around and looks at her. And if a dog could talk, he was telling her, don't you flip and move. If you move, you're in big trouble. And her baby had made it in with her. And so she stood there frozen. She decided she was not going to move. And he did not leave a mark on her. He was very gentle, but he was very firm. He pulled her in. And I had never seen that before. My jaw was kind of just hanging because I've never seen a dog do that. And I may never see it again. But that dog had had enough. She was preventing him from doing his job. So he knew he had to get her in that building. She would run off every time he would go to the other side of the stock to push them forward because he was going from back and forth along the back trying to push them in the building. And she would slow that down because every time he had to go get her, the sheep would back off from the building and we would have to start over again. So he had to deal with her and he wasn't going to leave her out there. He was not going to leave her in the cold and the rain. He knew what was happening, and he somehow is an amazing dog. He's really an amazing dog. He's one of those dogs that just knows. He knows what to do. It's like he's done this in a past life before. He just knows. I don't have to teach him. I hardly have to teach him anything. He just figures stuff out. It's pretty amazing. So as soon as she gets in there, then the other sheep are like, hey, there's another sheep in there, so maybe it's safe for us to go in, because that's how sheep think. And they started to move in a little bit at a time, and we finally got them in, finally got them all in the hay. The babies were happy to have their dry feet. That night, he probably, by doing what he did, saved some lambs' lives, because they were not exposed to elements. They were in a safe, dry place, and they were able to get their feet dry, stay warm. It was just amazing. I couldn't have done that myself. I could not have, because the bucket didn't move them. There's no way I could have done that by myself. And I may have lost lambs that night if I hadn't had a dog, and a dog that was just so incredibly brilliant to figure out what we were doing and add his own spin to it to make it work even more efficiently. That's just the thing that you get to see on a regular basis when you have these dogs, and you realize that these are dogs, and they're figuring this stuff out on their own, and they're thinking on their own, and they're making decisions on their own. It is amazing. So we will move on to number 4, loading trailers. This is not something that I do on a regular basis, but it is something that is done on a ranch on a sort of regular basis. And even if it's not done every day, it's something that is extremely valuable and needs to be done right. And it needs to be trained right. And if it's done and trained right, it can make life so much safer and so much easier. So I use trailers when I load up to go to the sale. If I'm going to maybe take stock to a trial or a demo, if I have to take an animal to the vet or a processor or something like that, that's when I use trailers. Now, the best way to load a trailer is to have chutes. If you have sheep, they should be narrow enough for the sheep to go forward and not turn around. The same with cattle, and sometimes you have to use different chutes if you have sheep and cattle. The safest way is to use a chute and then back the trailer up to the end of the chute, load them up there. Then the dogs just have to use pressure to keep them moving along the chute, and then sometimes put pressure on that first animal to get them in the chute and then go back. And the dogs don't go in the chute with the animals. The dogs move on the outside of the chute and just stay back far enough to put the pressure on the animals. If the dogs go in the chute with the animals, sheep is not as bad, but cattle, it can be very dangerous, because oftentimes there's not a place for that dog to escape. And if the cows decide to back up rapidly or start kicking, there's no place for the dog to get away. So you really don't want to send a dog down a chute after cattle, for sure. That's just kind of a safety issue. Sometimes if you don't have a chute, then the best thing to do is to back to a smaller pen where you have the animals in the pen, back to the gate of the pen, open the gate and the trailer, and then put pressure on the animals to get them in the trailer. That's the second best option for loading a trailer. You can load trailers out in the middle of a field somewhere. It's not the easiest way to do it, but a well-trained dog can figure that out oftentimes. I kind of prefer to set things up so that it's easier on the stock. And if it's easier on the dog, it's going to be easier on the stock too. Loading a trailer in the middle of the field is pretty hard. It can be done, but it's hard. And so the animals, everybody gets, the stock end up running more than they need to, and then the dog works harder than they have to, and it's not as smooth. But it can be done. And sometimes, that's your only option. That's what you do. When you have dog broke, and we're going to talk about that next, dog broke stock that's used to being worked by a dog, they learn to trust the dog. And when the dog tells them to move forward, they've trust that dog. And they understand that the pressure that dog brings to the situation, and they move forward. It's really a beautiful thing, the whole communication that can happen when you have dog broke stock, a dog that's well trained, in a situation that's safe and set up right. It's just beautiful, and the communication's amazing. So number 5, gentling livestock. A lot of people will use the term dog breaking livestock, and which I've already said a couple of times. I prefer the term gentling livestock. It's kind of like breaking a horse. People don't really say they break horses anymore. It just infers violence that doesn't need to happen, and usually doesn't happen if you do it right. So when you dog break livestock or gentle livestock, what you're doing is teaching the stock to move off the pressure of the dog. So when the dog says move forward, the stock learns to move forward. The dog says turn around, stop. The stock learns to turn around, stop. It's just understanding that this dog is in charge and that this dog is telling you what to do, and you have to listen to the dog because he's the leader now. It's not hard to do once you learn how to do it, but if you don't understand, if you're new at working dogs in stock, it's sometimes best to have somebody show you how to dog break stock, and there's different ways to do it. So I'm not going to talk about the different methods of breaking or gentling livestock, but it's definitely not a beginner activity. It's not hard after you learn how dogs and stock communicate together, but at the beginning, when you're really just learning how to work a dog, there's a lot to it. I mean, it sounds simple. When I'm talking about this, it sounds like, oh yeah, they just do that. They require some training, and they require effort, and they require you understanding how pressure works and how the pressure from the dog affects the stock. So I think that this is more of an intermediate to advanced level skill as far as the handler is concerned. The dogs can do this pretty well. Handler gentling of livestock requires a little bit of finesse. So reasons why do you want to gentle your livestock? Why is it important? When you gentle your livestock or you dog break your livestock, whatever you want to call it, the stock becomes calmer. They don't respond as reactively as they did before. The cows don't run tails up every time something happens and charge off with their heads high and their tails high and, running off not thinking. They'll walk. They're calmer. The sheep, same thing. Some sheep can be so flighty that if people come in the pen, the sheep can run. And if sheep just run, they can run into fences and hurt themselves. I've seen that happen where sheep were so wild that there wasn't a dog anywhere nearby. Just a person walks in with them and they start charging for the fences. So once you get the dogs in there, and it's tricky with that kind of livestock at first, you have to really work at it. That's why it's an intermediate to advanced skill if you've got some really wild stock. The other reason is that they're safer. And like with cattle, dog breaking cattle is imperative in my mind. I wouldn't want to be around cattle that were not dog broke. Dog broke cattle respect humans. They also respect dogs more. They're calmer. They don't run heads high, tails high, charging off into whatever. They don't charge you. They don't charge the dog. In most cases, if they're dog broke properly, you've got some very docile animals that are calmer. When they're running and their head is high, they're not thinking. And so they can run into things. They can hurt themselves. And every time that they're running weight off of them. So the more docile they are, the easier they are to deal with. My dog Harley is extremely good at dog breaking or gentling cattle. She's a very strong dog. She's very, very strong. Her presence when you watch her walk into an arena to trial or walk into a pen with animals, those animals know she's there before they see her. They can sense her presence and her power, and we've worked for a long time to teach her how to bring that in a little bit and not be so scary. And she does a really good job at it now. I had a student who had some cattle she wanted to work her dog on and be able to move with her dog, but her dog was young and not trained. She was not a weak dog, but she was not a trained dog. And when it comes to gentling cattle and training them to work around dogs, you can't use an untrained dog. This isn't a dog that has to be an advanced dog and an advanced handler to do this. So I went out to her place to dog break her calves, and they were probably 7, 8, 900 pound calves. They were not huge, but they're full, close to being very full grown. And they were in a round pen. So we started off in the round pen, and Harley walked in, and what we did was we just moved them in one direction, then we turned around and moved them in the other direction so that they learned that every time the dog came into their space, into their flight zone, they had to move off the dog. And that was what they did. And one red steer kept challenging her. And every time he would turn to face her like he was going to put his head down and run towards her, she would hit him on the nose, and he would turn around and go, okay, that's not worth it. But then he would change his mind very quickly and decide it was worth it, and he'd go back and do it again, put his head down and start charging towards her, and she would hit him on the head and turn him around. And never left a mark, but she told him very clearly, this is not acceptable, you need to move away. So he finally figured that out, and he would move with the group. And then we could change directions with the whole group, and no other problems from that one steer. He just decided he was going to be a pill. And that's kind of how it is. Usually there's at least one that does that. And within, I don't know, probably 15 minutes, those calves were very, very, very compliant, and I was able to fetch them to me. So after we move them along the fence, then I have her pull them off the fence, because if you just have them working on the fence, then the cows will never come off the fence because they're trained. They're very smart. They think, oh, we're supposed to walk along this fence. And then you have to teach them, no, when the dog goes into a certain point, you pull off the fence. And then they came fetching to me. And it was just, they were not super wild cows. They were used to humans. They were not the toughest calves to dog break by any stretch of the imagination, but it's all very calm. And this all happened in about 15 minutes. So once we were done dog breaking them and gentling them, I decided I needed to just test it to see if the student's dog could go in and move them, because they would move off of Harley, but most things do because she's very strong. So I needed to see if they were actually gentled. I had to use another dog to test it. And sure enough, this dog wasn't trained well enough to work them, but they moved off of her. And so then we knew we had done the job properly, that Harley had gentled this livestock and trained them to act around a dog. And as long as that dog then is trained and starts to work them properly, they should be fine. If that dog does not get trained and does not put the pressure on properly, the cattle will revert or learn worse habits. So that's, cattle are smart. You have to keep working on them, and you need to make sure that the dogs don't teach them bad habits. So that's why it's an advanced skill to dog break calves and sheep, because you have to really understand your livestock, and then you have to understand how the pressure is working on them. And to do it so that it sticks, and that then the dogs don't teach them bad habits either. So if you have cattle or sheep and you want to start training your dog, my recommendation would be to have somebody come in and dog break them for you, so that they're all ready to go, so that when you train, you've got this ability to work cattle or sheep that are moving off the dog and responding to the dog. So then you can just worry about putting the dog in the right place, rather than worrying about whether the animals are going to respond properly to the dog at that moment. So that is gentling livestock. So number 6, working cattle and sheep. Now, when I say working, I'm going to go work dogs, means I'm going to go out and train dogs, right? And I'm going to train my dogs to work stock. Kind of the cattleman or the sheep person's terminology for working is when they need to treat them, when they need to do something to them, which is like treating them, worming them, vaccinating, branding, whatever it is, they call it working. So we're going to work the cattle or work the sheep. So having a dog doing this is very helpful. In my situation, I have the electric net fences. I would never try to work anything like vaccinate, ear tag, worm, whatever it is, in the net fencing, because that's just not going to work. So I have the solid pen that I told you about, and I'm also building some more pens. They're under construction right now. So I would take my stock to the pens to work them. And with sheep, the best thing to have is like a tilt table or a sheep table. And you can send them through a chute into this smaller chute thing, and then you could squeeze them and tip them up if you need to trim their feet or do whatever you need to do. You can immobilize them. I don't have one of those right now. I've been fortunate to have extremely very healthy, very robust sheep. My sheep don't get sick. They don't really get worms that often. I very rarely have to treat them with anything. I'll vaccinate them once a year for overeating, and that's pretty much the extent of what I do. If somebody gets sick or injured, I might have to pull one in for antibiotics or stuff, but I really don't do a lot because I've been lucky. Eventually I'll get a tilt table, but for now it's just, I just do it this way. So this is how I do it. I don't have a ton of sheep, but I will use an alley. And so an alley is a long pen. It's about 10 to 12 feet wide, and it's pretty long. So what I'll do is I'll take one of those 55-gallon drums, and I'll put it just outside the fence at the back, the end of the alley where I'm going to be working. I tried once putting it in the fence with me, and then the sheep just knocked it over, and everything went everywhere, and you'd think I should have known better. So my advice is put it on the outside of the fence so you can just reach over the fence and grab your syringes or your wormer, your ear tags or whatever it is. Okay, So then what my dogs love this is like their favorite thing to do because they're Aussies, and Aussies are loose-eyed dogs. So there's loose-eyed dogs and tight-eyed dogs. Loose-eyed dogs are Australian Shepherds, regular collies, Shelties, those other kind of breeds like that, which means they work close. They don't use a lot of eye. Now, Aussies can have eye, and we won't talk about the difference. There's a difference between tight-eyed eye and loose-eyed eye. Like Harley has a lot of eye, but she's not like the tight-eyed, like Border Collies and Kelpies have that tight eye, which means they work a lot with their eye. They crouch a lot and they kind of creep. So that's the difference between a tight-eyed and a loose-eyed dog. So Aussies, being loose-eyed dogs, like to work really close. They can sense that bubble, that flight zone, but they really just like to be inside of it as much as possible. It's just how they are. So this is their favorite thing. So when I'm in the alley, when I'm working my sheep, like if I have to vaccinate, for example, I will have the dog push the sheep into the back of the alley, so I'm back in the corner, and it's, at that point, it's just like 10 or 12 feet wide, and then, the alley goes along, but at that point, it becomes a very small pen because the dog becomes the gate, and they push them up to me, so this is where I'm okay with the sheep being on top of me and crowding me, because then I can just reach over and grab the sheep that needs to be vaccinated, tilt its head up, vaccinate, mark, move on to the next one because they're all packed into a tight wad. Everything is safe, everything is quickly done, and it's very efficient, and the dogs love it. They just love it. I don't have to teach them. Mostly I have to teach them to get back a little bit because it's too tight. So that's how I work sheep. Now, you cannot do that with cows. No. That wouldn't be the wrong choice. So with cattle, you need to have a chute and a head gate. And unless you can rope a cow and pull it down, put it on the ground, stand its neck, and do what you need to do, you need to have a chute of some sort. So at that point, the dog becomes useful in helping you move them into the chute and down the chute, just like loading the trailer, except we're not going in the trailer, we're going into the head gate, and using a squeeze chute with the cattle is the safest way to do that. And that's how you would use, your dog to work cattle or sheep. Now, I just talked to you about 6 chores that I do on my ranch on a regular basis and how I use my dogs. I told you there was going to be one more. Number 7 is protection. This is something that Aussies are extremely good at. They started out as little ranch dogs in the western United States. And a lot of people that I know that have been in the breed for a while have told me that they got their first Aussie from a cowboy that they met at a rodeo or a litter of pups that was at a rodeo somewhere. The Aussies went to a lot of rodeos. They were brought in public a lot, not to work the stock, but to protect the cowboy's gear. So the cowboy would leave their gear in the back of the pickup truck or in the trailer, and the dog's job was to prevent someone from walking away with their gear while the cowboy was competing. There's a story going around, and I don't remember. If any of you know where this came from, feel free to message me. I don't know if it was Jay Sizzler or it was one of the original cowboys that had Aussies back in the day. And they would put a $100 bill or a $20 bill, some amount of money, in the bed of their truck and say, anyone that can get that money can have it. And the only thing that would stop that person from doing that was the dog in the back, and that was an Aussie. And that person never lost their money because that dog didn't let anyone near their truck. They're very, very protective, and that was valued. That it was extremely valuable back in the day. When I first started in Aussies, people were not as insane as they are now. And if a dog bit you, it was probably your fault, not the dog's fault. I was nipped by Aussies plenty of times when I first got started because I was somewhere the Aussie didn't want me to be. Not viciously attacked, but nipped. I mean, it happened. And it was, and so sometimes you're going to see that in the working lines. You're going to see this very highly developed protective instinct in these Aussies. And nowadays, it's kind of lost favor. Everybody's kind of paranoid about being bit by dogs, and you don't want to really be bit by dogs. I get that. I'm not saying we should be all like laying ourselves out there to be bit by the dogs, but people don't value the protectiveness of a dog anymore like they used to. And remember I was talking about the farms where the dogs had jobs? That was one of their jobs, to make sure that nobody came, that they were alerted if somebody came on the property, or that nobody that was not given permission to be there was not allowed to stay because the dog would chase them off. So you've got all this instinct, and when you're breeding instinctive dogs, you're going to get this instinct, which was protectiveness, coming out in these working dogs. You're going to see that. Pet breeding Aussies are trying to breed their Aussies to be more like golden retrievers and have that, really happy, friendly personality. And for pet homes, that's probably the best thing that could happen. So if you get a working Aussie, you may have to deal with this protectiveness. I don't have to worry about things when my husband's out of town on a business trip. I don't worry about anybody coming in my house because they're not going to leave unscathed. They're not going to get very far. I also know that I have to manage that. You have to make sure that they don't bite the mailman. And you have to make sure that they don't bite who they're not supposed to bite. Okay, they're not vicious, but they're protective. Harley, when you come up to my truck, sounds like the most terrifying dog on the planet. But when I take her out of the truck, she'll jump up and want to lick your face. This is because we're not having to do protective work in the truck, and they just think that's part of their job. They have that instinctive part of them. It's part of their job. My dog, my first Aussie Raisin, she was very protective. If anyone came near me, she was in between me and pushing me back and trying to get to them. I mean, she was so protective. They adore their people, and they love their families, and they want to do everything in the world that they can do to protect their families. My Aussies were great with my little toddler grandson who lived with us. They would never hurt him. They would protect him, but they would never hurt him. So it's not just an outright, aggression. It's not. It's a protective behavior that, should the zombie apocalypse come along, these are the guys I want on my side. That kind of thing. So if you're looking at a working Aussie, you may end up having to deal with that protectiveness, and you just need to train them like you train them to do anything else. There's a time to be protective, and then there's a time to not be protective. All right? That's going to kind of bring this episode to a close. And what I want to talk to you about next time is picking an Australian Shepherd that will work. Picking the dog you need to work on your farm. If you can't wait, go to workingaussiesource.com. Check out the litters there. And I don't know if we have any litters currently listed, but contact the breeders, because I will say this. You can go on Craigslist, or you can go Facebook group and find a $200 Aussie in the backyard tomorrow. There's a ton of them. There aren't as many working Aussies, and you need to do your research. You need to find an Aussie that works to your personality, that does the kind of work that you need done on your place, and that is bred by a working breeder. I'll say that very vehemently. The things that I talked to you about today, I could not do if I didn't have working bred Aussies. The 3 of my adults, the ones that I have not raised myself, came from breeders that are on that Working Aussie Source site. All 3 of my adult dogs came from breeders that are on that Working Aussie Source site. I wouldn't go anywhere else because I know the bloodlines, and I know the breeders, and I know what I was looking for, and I specifically had litters in mind. And here's what I had to do. I had to give them a deposit, and I had to wait till the litter was born, and then I had to pay the rest of the money and pick up my puppy. I had to wait. One of my litters, I had to wait a couple of times because the one litter didn't take, or one breeding didn't take, and that's Copper, and he's the best dog. He's just such a good dog. He's such a good dog. It's worth waiting for, because if you go and look at a litter of puppies, you're not going to, unless you have the resolution of a stone, you're not going to walk away without a puppy, because they're so darn cute and so interactive, even if it's not the right breeding for you, even if it's not a working litter. So my advice is, do not go look at puppies until you have the right litter in mind. Okay? And so I will do a couple episodes coming up on how to pick a puppy and how to pick working breeders and all that good stuff. I hope you enjoyed this. Please go to our Facebook group, in the Working Aussie Source Facebook group, or the Instinctive Australian Shepherd Facebook group, either one or both, and tell me how you use your dogs on your place. Maybe you do these chores a little bit differently. Maybe you do different chores. And there are other things that Aussies can do. I just picked the most common ones that I use at my place. So share with us how you will use your Aussies on your farm or ranch. And if you've never thought about using an Australian Shepherd on your ranch or farm, reach out, ask your questions. You can reach out to me personally. You can reach out to the group at the Working Aussie Source. They're very, very helpful. Ask your questions and, ask people to send you some videos of their dogs actually doing the chores. And you will be amazed at how wonderful this dog can be as a team member on your ranch. Subscribe to the podcast. Tell your friends about the podcast. And go on and join the conversation in our Facebook group, the Working Aussie Source or the Instinctive Australian Shepherd. And I look forward to hearing from you, and I will see you down the road.